Hi, my name is Katja Vogt and I teach philosophy at Columbia University.
Hi, my name is Jens Haas and I'm a photographer and artist. Another angle you can look at the movie is a theme of liberation, I think. I can't help but think of 30 years back, where's the prison chant from? Ice cream, you scream, we scream for ice cream, down by law.
I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. Well, no, that's fair.
I wonder if you're 16 years old and now watch this movie. I mean, maybe you wouldn't connect to it at all. I don't know. Depends. But I find it oddly liberating. I mean, here you have this guy, Jarmusch, who makes this movie that more than any of the ones he made beforehand is a direct extension of his life. Not the vampire theme, but the artist, the life of the artist in the society today. And he obviously made a successful life out of what he's doing. I mean, he's deliberately not doing the Hollywood thing. He's not doing many of the things that filmmakers, I guess, are tempted to try each and every day of their lives. He doesn't do that, and he consistently doesn't do it for decades. And it kind of worked for him. So there's this artificial, high culture, whatever thing that we can debate, but it worked for him. So there are no children, he doesn't hold down a steady job. All the things I think when you're 16, you may feel that's expected. That's what I have to do with my life. I have to study, I have to do this, I have to hold down a job, I have to have a family, I have to have children, I have to do all these things. All great things and things that are missing from Jarmusch's movies. But here he is with an option. You can do that, and if you have the talent and the determination, you don't have to make movies, but you can live this life that's quite an unusual life and somehow make it work. And it seems not a big deal if you're more grown up and look at this, and because evidently it worked. But if you're young, and I guess it's maybe not even figuring that this would be an option. And that I like a lot about the movie, and that's a theme I think that goes from many of his movies all the way back to something like Down by Law, where the circumstances are never great in Jarmusch movies, but there's a hidden joy that's just not going away, even in this vampire movie. And I find that oddly encouraging and liberating. I like it a lot.
Another thing that strikes me about the quote by Tilda Swinton that you mentioned before, that she thought it was so interesting to play someone who is 3,000 years old. Philosophers are quite interesting in what it would be like to be immortal, not in the sense of, immortality of the soul in a religious sense, but just to live and live and live and live with no end in sight. And then there's the question of whether it would be quite boring, because a lot of what seems to give meaning to our lives are things that involve somehow the danger and death and losing people and things ending in one way or another. Someone dies, or you yourself are going to die. So they are in this world where things just seem to go on forever. And even their marriage, she says at some point that they are married for the third time now. And they seem to, once in a while they celebrate their marriage, but they just seem to be together forever and forever. And that is also an interesting question. I think people might think it would be really boring to be married to the same person forever. And they seem to think that's just perfect, because that one person is the person that interests you. And that's only going to get better because, as you share these experiences, it is just more and more interesting. And that, I think, also is a great dimension of the movie, that it, as it were, suggests that with more experience, with more exposure to culture, with more memory of the amazing things that have already happened in the human experience, sort of in human culture, with more of that, things only get more interesting. I tend to think, like we said before, that the movie is very much about Jim Jarmusch himself and his generation and his life as a musician and artist and so on. And I think you're right, that generation is kind of oddly ageless. if you are not yourself becoming a parent and sort of going through all the stages in life that come with that and all the changes, then maybe you still dress as if you were 20, but really you look into the person's face and she's not 20. And then that is very much a play with these characters. I think when you see them from far away, they look as if they could be young, hipsters, but really then when you see them, they have these ageless, gray, pale faces. And at moments when they are desperate or when something isn't going well, they look like they could be like 100 years old. And both of the actors, I think, are extremely good at playing that range between looking like a young musician and looking like an undead 2 centuries old creature.
I mean, I believe it was said about Jim Jarmusch that he soaks up contemporary culture like a sponge. And if I'm not mistaken, he grew up in the 1970s. So that's, I think that were his formative years. But it's obvious that he seems to follow as kind of a hobbyist. For example, what happens in philosophy and this recent interest in vampires and all these thought experiments regarding death, like the experiment if you knew that 30 days after your death, whenever that is, the world will come to an end. There will be nothing. How would that influence how you live your life? Or would it? And Jarmusch, from a distance, seems to read these kinds of things and seems to know what's going on or what people are interested in, and perhaps that adds a little bit to the sense of agelessness that lingers not only around these films that he makes, but also about him as a person. And it's an interesting touch, whether it's desirable or not. I mean, that's for anyone to decide, but yeah, it seems to be a prominent feature of this kind of life that he's living.
It's like a cigarette never tastes like that, Share a cigarette with your lover.
Oh, that's bliss.
That I'm gonna miss. Also with coffee and cigarettes, That's like breakfast of champions.
Another kind of contemporary dimension or kind of contemporary commentary maybe that is part of the movies, that you see Detroit as a kind of wasteland. And that has been a magnet for a lot of artists, photographers.
Oh, speaking of cliches, right? Because I recall, another thing that Jarmusch may be reading a lot at the time, at least, photo blogs. There was this term coined ruin porn. So every photographer went to Detroit and took the same pictures. It got boring pretty quickly, but that was, I think, a few years after that, the movie was made. So yes, these things, that's the cultural sponge thing, I think.
Right.
You don't even judge it. You notice it and you make something of it.
And they visit some of these places that maybe 100 years ago in Detroit were really wealthy, amazing buildings, and now they are deserted parking grounds. And there's a kind of moment where it's almost as if Jarmusch is just going there as a photographer, and he kind of wants to document what it looks like now and to kind of invite you to imagine what it has been. And so the movie takes you, in some sense, shamelessly on this tour of greatest hits of, those are the sorts of things that have interested artists. And whether that is a deserted parking lot in Detroit or whether it is Schubert is totally, it's just all in there. In Detroit, they go to Jack Rice's house, or they look at the sites that have currently been themes in photography and so on. Whereas in Tangier, then they talk about Shakespeare and Chris Marlowe and so on. So right, it seems as if these different locations where they are also come with different artwork. In Detroit, they also go into a club where then it turns out that Jim Jarmusch's own music is played.
That's your music.
It seems almost more about the lifestyle of the artist compared to the lifestyle of the vampire. I mean, the vampire thing is almost just incidental. I mean, yes, you need the blood and it drives the plot, but the plot is never really important for Jarmusch, I think so.
I would say, though, that there is also kind of like almost moral commentary here, the way in which they compartmentalize their need for blood. And they compare that to, how humans use up all the oil, or they talk about water, problems that people are going to run into with water and with oil and so on. And they aim to compare like an oil crisis or crisis with water to their crisis of not having enough blood.
Oh, they've succeeded in contaminating their own fucking blood, never mind their water.
Yeah, well, if we're gonna have a litany of all the zombie atrocities of history, we'll be here till the sun comes up.
So they try and come across like these very concerned political citizens, and really part of how it comes across is that they are rationalizing what they are doing, and they are rationalizing what is sort of their sin, namely that they drink people's blood. And they compare it to, us using up resources. And then the kind of moral commentary seems to be, question mark, is that a good comparison? Maybe it is.
Have the water wars started yet? Or is it still about the oil?
Yes, they're just starting now.
The way in which the movie invites us to kind of feel what it's like to be a vampire is incredibly successful by those kinds of tools that remind us that, we have the same sorts of concerns. We worry about the contamination of our resources. They worry about the contamination of their resources. And the vampire perspective is, what's the difference? And we might insist that there is a difference. But the movie is in no way moralizing. The movie is more almost comical in that respect, that it invites you to just experience the world as you would as a vampire, and maybe even to think that they are, as artists, somewhere kind of in between, kind of regular people and vampires, because it becomes quite imaginable that there are some of us, maybe artists, maybe also some others, who live very much like them, who sort of like take that observer's perspective, kind of feed on observing what other people do, coming up with stories, coming up with ideas by observing others. I think a lot of, say, photographers would describe their own work like this, that they try and stay behind the scenes, they observe the world, they try and pull something out of it, and then create artwork from that.
It's a white dwarf, it's the compressed heart of a star. And it's not only a radiant diamond, but it also emits the music of a gigantic gong.